Just in time for your annual CPE planning, ACI Learning is reformatting and re-releasing our entire audit library to make our binge-worthy NASBA-certified CPE training videos shorter and easier to digest. That means your CPE exams for each course will now be shorter too. As an auditor, you have to stay up to date on all the latest regulatory and compliance requirements for your company. ACI's library of more than 620 hours of engaging audio-video training, webinars, podcasts, and forums help your auditors stay current. It's training that engages. Our top 10 courses have a better than 90% completion rate. Learning is a journey, not a destination. As the amount and speed of change increases, it creates risks and opportunities. Our ability to help others and advance in our careers depends on us becoming lifelong learners. Find out more about our offerings as you plan your annual CPE at www.acilearning.com/products/auditpro. Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So good to have you here with us. Really appreciate you joining us. And thank you to Rob as well, Rob Clark, who is joining us to talk about all of the different things that has happened during 2023 and start to take a look into what we maybe want to focus on for 2024. Hello, Rob. How are you?
Dr. Murdock, how are you, my friends? Good to see you.
Nice to see you too as well. I am doing fine. Thank you so much. So it's been a very interesting year, to say the least. A lot has happened, and the year is not done yet, but we're getting close to the end. So it's a good time to recap, take a look at things, and we are big believers in retrospectives, in reflective moments. So let's do just that. So as we are talking about 2023, we have a lot of different things going on. We're going to try to take a systematic approach. We have only about an hour, so we want to make sure that we cover some of these topics and as well give some time to our viewers so that they can also ask some questions of us. So we'll have a Q&A section towards the end as well. So let's take a look at some of the things that we put together, and we'll talk through some of these things. And how about we begin with economic dynamics? Definitely something that are of concern to every individual privately, but as auditors, risk compliance individuals, we should also take a look at these dynamics from that vantage point. So what are some of the thoughts that you have as relates to the developments in 2023 in the area of economic developments?
Well, thanks, Hernan. When we think about everything that the world has been through after suffering through 2 years of the pandemic and emerging from that, and then getting into situations where you've got the collapse of FTX and you've got rising inflation, you've got interest rates that are skyrocketing, and how that is impacting virtually every organization in every sector. As auditors, we have to always be looking at how does this impact the organization? And how can we make sure that as a part of our risk assessment that we have visibility into that and that the board and senior leadership are aware of all of these type of economic impacts?
Yeah, so you mentioned rising interest rates, and of course that's a very important thing. Generally speaking, people think in terms of the impact on their loans, and at a corporate level or at the institutional level, the same thing applies. Organizations have loans as well. So as these interest rates continue to go up, one of the things to keep in mind is perhaps taking a look to see what is our debt position as an organization and whether or not those are fixed rate or variable rate, and what does that mean? Is there a cap? Is there a provision? Do we have any mechanism to protect the organization as these interest rates go up, which brings with it the interest payments? How are we handling that? So what are your thoughts about that particular piece of it? Because that might be applicable to just about every enterprise, correct?
It really is. There's not a single industry or business in any industry that is immune from that. And if you consider strategic plans and capital improvements and new strategic initiatives that are going to require significant loans and financing, that posture has changed and is continuing to change. So, how does that impact the organization's ability to continue to achieve its strategic objectives and making sure that there's a thoughtful approach in terms of the investment worthiness of the organization and ensuring that we are keeping pace with all of those emerging areas of risk? And I don't see that
Right.
we as internal auditors are obviously going to be able to solve those issues, but certainly we want to make sure that the decision makers are well equipped to have visibility into those risk factors as they are making strategic decisions.
Exactly right. Those of our viewers and listeners who may be working, for example, in the banking industry, they're familiar with stress testing and how some of these dynamics are managed within those organizations. There are regulatory requirements along those lines, but for a lot of other organizations, that may not be as directly connected. But to your point, Rob, it's important for us to take a look to see what is our position and making sure that we have the liquidity to address some of these dynamics. And also, as we're making our plans, that we're also reflecting those interest rates in our long-term projections, payback ROI, and things like that. We have a couple other entries here about Coinbase and FTX, which of course relate to crypto and different dynamics that happen in that environment as well. Let's take a look at something else though. Let's take a look at technology, which is something that's very broadly applicable. And we have a couple of things mentioned here. So where would you like to begin?
Well, let's start with what everyone is talking about with ChatGPT and artificial intelligence and how that is
Hmm.
impacting every organization and organizations that are utilizing AI and organizations that are identifying what some of the potential risks are with that. You know, you hear a lot. It was interesting. I had an opportunity to speak with Scott Lyons at a conference recently, and I think our session was the only session that didn't have AI in its title. And we thought, I'm not even sure if anyone's going to show up because that's all everyone wanted to talk about. Well, we did actually have quite a number of folks in there, and
Good.
the way that artificial intelligence is incorporated into every business now, I think, is something that quite frankly, a lot of businesses are not well prepared for. How do we deal with that? What are the policies associated with the utilization of things like Chat GPT so that you're not inadvertently exposing personal identifiable information, uh, intellectual property, which is a significant risk factor for us in higher education. So we want to make sure that there are the strategies in place to be able to walk along with the increasing development of that. On the positive side, I think there's phenomenal opportunities for us in internal auditing to take advantage of some of the AI technology. And talking with some of my colleagues, Phil Hurd, who I know is one of our colleagues that has done a phenomenal job of putting in place and leveraging off of AI to do AI based training and education and awareness, improving policies, uh, having the efficiencies with data analytics. There's a lot of opportunities that we should be availing ourselves of. You hear people talking about being fearful of AI taking over people's jobs, and you hear the common response that AI is not going to take over people's jobs or replace people's jobs. They're going to replace people who don't use AI in their jobs.
Mhm.
So it's incumbent upon us to really become familiar with ways in which we can leverage off of that technology, but also doing so in a way that's going to make sure that we're not inadvertently exposing parts of our intellectual property and personal data.
Right. So as we're thinking about something like this, then with those large language models, then we're thinking in terms of how it is being used. If you have individuals who are basically getting their own subscriptions and going outside the organization and running routines and scripts and trying to get answers, they may be allowing information out of the organization that they would rather not, or that they should know not to do. But if they were to deploy it within the organization, there are some ways that we can try to manage that better so that we have some privacy and some protection of that information. So you raise a very important point there. And another thing I would like to underscore is where are we looking at AI from the perspective of auditing it within the organization and its use, or are we using or thinking of it in terms of how we use it as internal auditors and risk and compliance professionals? So a couple different perspectives to this very rapidly growing topic and how it's impacting pretty much everything that we
Mhm.
do, even in ways that we don't realize. There are a couple other items mentioned here, but I guess the general theme for the Hive item, the MGM, Sony, and ransomware and data leaks has to do with just that, which is the cyber threats and the number of those, and this, of course, this is just a very small number. Some probably some of the bigger names that have shown up this year, but that's a recurring problem, and the imperative to make sure that we are prepared to handle eventualities, because as many people say nowadays, it's not just a matter of what will we do if it happens, but what are we going to do when it happens. So
Mhm.
definitely a shift in the way we see cybersecurity, and we need to be mindful of that as well. One of the things
Yeah,
I
I
want
think.
to, yes, go ahead.
Well, I think just I'm waiting for somebody to write the script on the Hive ransomware shutdown. That has to be one of the coolest stories that I've
Mm,
heard. With for those who are not familiar with that, I want to make sure we're not just glossing over some of these things that perhaps
right.
might be talked about, but people might not necessarily know all the nuances of that. So there is the Hive ransomware group that is identified as having Russian links, and the FBI was able to actually infiltrate that system, and secretly for about 7 months they sat within the system and quietly were uh, sending victims of this organization's ransomware attacks, was sending them the decryption keys to allow them to be able to recover their data, and thereby avoiding what would have been the payment over $130 million worth of ransomware fines. So that's just one of the coolest stories. There's got to be a movie at some point that comes out about that, and I can't wait to watch that because that's a geek nerd's dream when it comes to that. Um, when
Absolutely.
you look at situations that what happened with MGM and Sony and Caesars and all of these high profile areas, I think it is very clear, and those are widely publicized. And MGM was reported to have lost over $100 million in earnings as a result of that. And all of that was based on, as it turns out, social engineering of compromising critical IDs and access, and then being able to infiltrate and encrypt over 100 different hypervisors and stealing personal data, and then inadvertently having to for Sony, they were compromised by the Move It breach, and 6,800 employees, current and former employees, had to be informed that their data was compromised. MGM had the loss of personal identifiable information, from everything from license numbers to social security numbers to passport numbers to dates of birth, everything that people would need in order to commit identity theft. So the reputational damage to organizations has been widely publicized. But most organizations, I'm wondering if every organization that is represented by people who are watching today is, as if they're looking at those situations saying, whew, glad that wasn't us. Man,
Mm.
that would be bad if that were happened to us. And perhaps even having a false sense of security in terms of what their overall posture is. I've been a part of 5 different educational institutions, and I have experienced and had to walk through ransomware attacks and responses at a couple. And I can tell you that it is completely disruptive, and making sure that every business, regardless of its size and complexity, is prepared, as you said, not if, but when they suffer some type of breach. And we just need to make sure that we as auditors are walking alongside of the leadership and the technology professionals to make sure that we are strategic in how to minimize the likelihood of that, and then ensuring that there's an incident response plan that is thoroughly vetted, as well as a business continuity plan that is going to allow the organization to be able to recover. So those are the things that every auditor who's watching this right now can help to add value at your organization by participating in.
Excellent point. Absolutely. Those are great suggestions. I hope people are paying attention and taking note, because those are great things as far as our planning going forward and how we can help our organizations be better prepared to deal with those things. One of the things I wanted to highlight as well is that by participating in today's webinar, you can get one CPE credit as well. But we need you to answer to 3 polling questions, and the first one is coming up right now. So please respond, and we'll talk about it on the other side. Very good. Okay, so definitely, ChatGPT and other large language models have captured our attention and our imagination as well in 2023. Such a new technology in many respects. It's been around for a little bit in research levels, but as far as being broadly available, mass consumed, that's definitely something that became the thing this year. And as you mentioned, Rob, we're looking in terms of how that is impacting organizations and how we are thinking of adopting it as well, right? Within our profession, which is what we commented earlier, and how the organization is doing it. But the question then becomes, what are we doing helping our clients as relates to that? So I'm curious to see what the results are in terms of our audience today and what their experience has been so far, because this is a rapidly changing dynamic, number one, but also something that has repercussions to our organizations. So let's wait for those numbers to come through. Any thoughts, Rob, as we wait for those numbers to be ready?
Well, I saw one of the responses that said, "I don't know," and I hope we don't have too many of those responses. I hope that there are some folks who are at least aware of. Look at that. There's 17 that say, "I don't know." Okay, well, I guess perhaps what needs, and the fact that there's not a whole lot that said widely or very widely, I think what that
Mhm.
tells us is really, that's actually not surprising, quite frankly, because
Being
I
somewhat
think it is
cautious, I
still
guess.
such a, what's that? I'm sorry.
I guess organizations in many respects are being cautious.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And quite frankly, people are still trying to figure out, how do we navigate this? How do we use this?
Right.
And how do we make sure that we're doing so in a way that is prudent and not completely risk averse, but at least taking into consideration what those risk factors are so that we could make sure that those risks are appropriately addressed and mitigated.
Right. Yeah. Now, I want to make a comment on that. I don't know, and you pointed that out as well. My philosophy is that when questions like this, and this is something that those who have attended our other webinars in the past probably as well. My suggestion, when and as we designed the question, we put it up. Part of the takeaway from the I don't know is then we probably need to go find out because there
Exactly.
may be something there in terms of something potentially surprising or reassuring. We don't know yet, but we need to find out. And that's part of our role in terms of auditors providing a reasonable assurance to the organization. And if there are dynamics that are potentially risky and troublesome, then we need to highlight those. So even the I don't knows carry a message as well and could be a call for action. So let's come back to our uh, arrangement of themes within 2023. And the next set have to do with geopolitical dynamics. We've had two major events happen in 2023. Actually, one of them in 2022 crossed over into 2023 as well. The war in Israel is more recent, and then the war in Ukraine. So, what are your takeaways as far as that goes? And what are the kinds of things we need to know? It's not just a newsworthy, it is definitely a lot of human impacts for sure. But what, from a professional, from an audit perspective, what are some of the takeaways?
Well, I imagine that we have some folks who are watching this who are globally based and perhaps have a better appreciation for exactly what those impacts are for other, as opposed to other organizations that are based strictly within the United States. And
Yes.
I wonder if we are getting too comfortable from watching the news and seeing all of these conflicts, and actually sitting in the comfort of our own homes watching this and thinking, wow, I'm glad that's not happening here. I'm glad it's over there. But let's face it, the global community is ever shrinking in terms of its interdependencies. And when we think about everything that is happening in Ukraine, in Israel, that do have far reaching impacts globally, not only regionally within. I mean, Ukraine has been referred to as part of the breadbasket of Europe in terms of some of its grain
It's true.
production. And now those farmlands are completely wiped out. And the food insecurity is at an all time high, not just in Ukraine, but and that's spilling over into other aspects within the European Union. And then even from what's going on in Israel with the, they're talking about having, Israel could lose about $400 billion over the next 10 years in terms of its economic impact. And when we consider the supply chain of issues, everything from logistics to healthcare, to pharmaceuticals and medical supplies and semiconductors and logistics and energy, all of these things end up having a trickle effect, not only in the region in which those uh, events are occurring, but the global impact on that as well. When you then consider what happens as a result of that relative to the increase in terror threats and how that has been exacerbated, I know we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but these things are tied to that as well. So I think looking at, if we take into consideration what we learned from COVID and the supply chain issues that we ran into, that every country ran into, but we experienced here, particularly in the United States, we want to make sure that organizations are well prepared to be able to address some of those supply chain challenges and then take into consideration how to mitigate some of those different risks.
Very true. Yes. I was thinking about something that was widely spoken about at the very beginning of the war in Ukraine had to do with what you highlighted, which was the food insecurity situation of there's of wheat and soy and so on, and sunflower, and um, and how we don't hear as much about it, but the problem is still there. So we found some ways to ameliorate some of it and finding other sources in many respects, but still, it is still disrupting many things in our world. It's not just an American viewpoint, but we need to make sure we look at things globally as well. And as far as the technology out of Israel as well, that's another thing. So you highlighted the potential economic impact there as well. So many dynamics to be on the lookout for. Now let's turn our attention to another one, which has to do with culture or organizational culture. What are some of the takeaways there?
Well, I see from the discussion topics we've highlighted there, the whole concept of working from home and a hybrid work environment, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging is seen as a strategic priority for a lot of organizations. How do they deal with that, though? How does your organization actually respond to that? Taking those in the order in which presented, when we think about working from home, everyone was forced to have to do that during COVID. And quite frankly, a lot of organizations were not necessarily adequately prepared to be able to address that. But then once people became comfortable with that, well, let's face it, people prefer not having to get in a car and deal with traffic, and they prefer to, work in their, pajama pants and slippers, and perhaps wearing a suit above the camera so people could see. But people enjoyed that, and now we're expecting that that is going to be the way that we will continue going forward. But if you think about all of the different, and certainly there's some benefits to that, and the benefit of a work life balance that, quite frankly, could also be a detriment if people don't build in the appropriate parameters to make sure that they're shutting off their workday and that it tends to be just a 24-hour job at some points for some folks. But when we look at things from the perspective of what is the organization's posture for this? How do we go about attracting and retaining appropriate staff when people are actually using that as a bargaining chip to say, well, I'll work for you guys if I'm able to be remote. And our organization's well prepared to be able to address that, particularly in some of the fields such as information technology that are so competitive. And I think just making sure that the organization is able to match that with appropriate security protocols that are put in place. Because now, if you are relying on people using their home networks, what type of security protocols are you putting in place to make sure that you are mitigating some of those areas of risk? So I think that is never going to go away. I think the cat's out of the bag at this point, and there's no way to be able to. Who puts cats in a bag anyway? I never understood that phrase, but anyway, I want to make sure that our organization is well prepared to be able to address that. From the
Absolutely.
diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, I think those are what I see from that is organizations might indicate that to be a strategic priority. But really, if you peel back the layers of the onion and start looking at, okay, are they just talking that? Or is there actually evidence to support that there are resources and strategic prioritization to actually execute on that? Or is that just a nice talking point? We as auditors can actually look at it and see and provide feedback to our leadership at our organizations to say, well, we see that you've outlined that as a strategic priority, but as we actually take a look at it, there might be some operational gaps in terms of exactly how you're executing that.
Right. Exactly. And I think it's important for organizations to not look at that in a narrow way. I'm looking at the DEIB element at this point. So it's not just, oh, we're doing it just so we are like everybody else, but rather we're looking at it and we're doing it because we see the benefit. There's a human element, of course, but from a business perspective, we're looking in terms of recruitment, talent retention, and how it may limit your ability to achieve your goals if you don't have the number and the type of people that you want to take the organization there. And number two, in terms of the ability of employees to feel comfortable enough to do well and to excel and to be productive. So that motivating element to feel that, yes, I can be my genuine self at work and I can bring my talents and I can use them to their full potential because I feel included. That I think is part of the way we also need to think of it and not just as a compliance exercise, but there are so many positives to it. So, as auditors, we also want to highlight the value creation opportunity of this topic as well. Now, let's turn our attention to one other topic here, and that has to do with the environment. So, what are some of the takeaways and their structure here in terms of some of these unfortunate calamities that we have seen over the last few years? In 2023, we're seeing it again. So, it's been a run up in terms of these dynamics. But what do you make of some of these things, and what should we take away from them?
uh, I'm making from this that people are like, man, these guys are like downers. I'm feeling depressed about all this stuff. I mean, do you have anything positive to talk about, Rob? I mean, what you're just talking about all the bad stuff that's going on, everything that could happen. I need a nap now. I need to sit down. My wife bugs me about that all the time. She's like, why do you just always think of the worst case scenario? I'm thinking, because I'm an auditor, because that's what we do, right? We're always thinking about what the worst case scenario is and looking at things and then saying, how is that likely to impact? What is the trickle down effect for that? So when it comes to some of the things that you see listed on the screen here with the floods, the heat waves, the wildfires, when we think about, okay, yes, those are natural disasters, but really asking the question, so what? Not just so what because people's lives have been impacted, but how does that impact? What are the risks? What are the implications for that? And when we consider how that contributes to, obviously we want to prioritize life and life safety issues. But if we look at what the impact is on life and property, if we consider then all of the additional environmental contaminants that as a result of some of these things that end up with air contaminants, with toxic waste, with radiation, with chemicals in the food and water supply as a result of some of these things. How do people within those geographical areas respond to that? What is the impact on the insurance companies? I mean, insurance rates are skyrocketing, not only from environmental issues in those areas of the country and the world that are more susceptible to natural disasters, but even as we're talking about technology, cybersecurity insurance is going up to the point where it's becoming cost prohibitive for a lot of organizations. So, how do we make sure that we are taking all of these things into consideration when there is a reduction of resources and a loss of food and water that contributes to additional food insecurity, not only in in those parts of the world, but those parts of the world that then feed information and food to other parts of the world. The energy costs, the supply chain issues, all of those things are impacted. So, how does your organization deal with some of these types of adverse situations that occur? And how do we make sure that we're well positioned to be able to mitigate those risks as best as possible? Those are the questions we have to wrestle with.
Exactly. Right. So we're thinking in terms of resilience. We're thinking in terms of protecting assets, protecting lives of our employees and the people who work with us, and customers and vendors. In making sure that as we're thinking about the ecology and all of the naturally uh, problematic dynamics associated with it, we're also thinking from the business perspective in terms of how can we help the organization continue operating as seamlessly as possible given these dynamics. And you mentioned the cost dynamics as well. So important to
Yeah.
understand some of these things. So these again, uh, use dynamics that captured our attention during 2023. Before we move into 2024, which is the next thing we're going to look into, and hopefully we can address your comment there about the negative perspective on some of these topics. We can have a more of an uplifting angle next time around. But before that, let's have another polling question to make everyone eligible for CPE credits. So the next question, please. Very well. So, as we're thinking in terms of the dynamics associated with the weather, the climate, the natural events that have been so disruptive in many respects, we need to think in terms of how prepared we are to address those and to be responsive enough that we can continue operations as seamlessly as possible. So, let's take a look at those results and see what we can extract from it. So, extremely disruptive. We depend on predictable and stable weather. 8% of you said that. Very disruptive, 15. Somewhat disruptive, 31. And then minimally disruptive, almost half. So, 46%. So, again, it's a wide range. A lot of it seems to be clustered around the middle between minimally and somewhat disruptive. So, again, not as critical, but something to be on the lookout for. Okay, so let's
Well,
take a
Dr.
look at
Murdock,
2024, Rob. Yes, yes, yes. Sorry, go ahead.
before we do, I want to pick up on that because when you have 46% that are saying floods and those types of natural disasters are seen as potentially being minimally disruptive, I think that there can be potentially a false sense of security that organizations have if they are not in one of those geographical areas in which there's a higher susceptibility to those natural disasters. to think
Uh-huh.
that they don't necessarily have to be as diligent in their business continuity and disaster recovery plans. And if we look at the data that comes out that actually verifies what the number one issue is that causes organizations to have to implement a business continuity or disaster recovery plan, it's nothing that we showed on that list. It's power outages. Power outages are the number one issue that force organizations to have to implement a business continuity plan. So for those 46% that are thinking like, that's not us, we're good. Good luck to the people in Florida, good luck to the people in California, but don't be lulled into a false sense of security. Take into consideration that the infrastructure that we have in our power grid and our infrastructure with our utilities, that is a potential point of vulnerability. And we saw what happened with the high powered rifles that took out a couple transformers back in the North Carolina last year that took out power to a wide swath of customers. And if we consider what happened last winter down in Texas when the power grid came to a screeching halt, every business is impacted by that. So every business ought to be prepared for how we're going to address, not if, but when there is some type of power outage.
Interesting. I appreciate that because that really underscores that concept of risk and not only thinking about what you expect to happen, but to the extent that we can hopefully anticipate things that are unusual and so on. And just to underscore one thing, because you made me think of something else here, it has to do with the fact that a lot of these events, natural events, some of them are happening, those one in 500 years, one in 1,000 years, or just call them fluke, right? These things where we never used to have X and now we do. So that
Mhm.
definitely adds to what you just said, Rob. So I really appreciate you adding that perspective to that because you're right. We may be lulled into a false sense of security. Okay, so let's
Okay,
take a
so
look at
now let's
2024.
let's look ahead so we're not so depressed.
Yes, yes, yes. Let's do that. Let's do that. Uh, so, two things that we're looking forward to 2024. One of them has to do with the IAA updating the standards. Is supposed to have a reveal happening sometime in January, towards the end of January. So we have that, and then we have guidance on compliance programs from the OIG. So, quickly, what are some of the takeaways that you have on those two events?
Well, it's exciting anytime that you have a professional body such as the Institute of Internal Auditors that actually goes through that level of due diligence to really evaluate the standards, the international professional practices framework, and look at ways in which we could make sure that we as auditors as a profession are emerging, we're adapting, we're growing, we're taking into consideration the changing landscape of risks that we face. I've been in the internal audit field since the late 80s, and it's just been remarkable to see the progression of the profession of internal auditing over the years and moving from strictly an assurance function with arm's length distance to more of a assurance and consulting activity, providing opportunities for us as auditors to be adding value. Well, this next iteration of the standards that Hernan, as you said, are anticipated to have that big reveal within the coming weeks here is really going to be challenging every internal audit personnel leader to really look at how we need to be adapting to these. And we don't have enough time in this particular segment to really talk about all of the substantive changes that are part of that. But there are some things that I think are worth highlighting. And one of those is the reliance upon technology. In years past, it used to be that internal audit shops had financial auditors, operational auditors, and then maybe in a back hallway in a closet, we had the IT auditor or
Hmm.
EDP auditor at those things. But now the expectations are that as a part of every audit, we are going to take into consideration all of the technology related risks associated with that process. Because let's face it, in most of our organizations, there's not a single process that does not rely upon or impact our information technology. So we want to make sure that as auditors, we're walking step with that. So that's one of the things that I think is going to be a particular challenge for organizations to make sure that they are well equipping their auditors. The expectation that there's going to be 20 hours of professional development for the internal audit team every year, that's going to have a budgetary impact that organizations are required to do now by the standards. They've changed a number of the references from shall to must. There's going to be the expectation that there is an overall risk ranking associated not only with every audit observation within the report, but the report itself is to be ranked and have some sort of risk scale. That's going to change things pretty dramatically for a lot of organizations that have not necessarily reported things to the leadership, to the board in that manner. So it's going to be an exciting time. And I think, just adapting to these changes and being well prepared, I think it would be prudent for every auditor to really familiarize themselves with what those proposed changes are, because I believe it's likely to come out as it's represented right now. And it should be interesting.
Right. I agree. We are on the lookout to see what the final version of these standards look like and what the implications are for us. But yes, it's supposed to increase the professionalism and the rigor and the way we communicate some guidance in terms of how that is supposed to be done. So, a couple of other items on this particular section here, looking in terms of economic slowdown. We spoke about that. We're trying to stay a little bit more positive. So maybe I should say that the forecast is that that could be one of the outcomes. So we're talking about a soft landing, and chances are interest rates will probably start to go down as well. So
Mhm.
high interest rates may turn into a more moderate interest rates, and hopefully they'll start to go down, and hopefully we'll start to see things go back to the area where the Fed and most of the analysis and forecasts allow for that more predictable dynamic in terms of inflation, economic growth, and so on. Then we have AI regulations and so on. As that becomes more pervasive, we're seeing some efforts to try to provide some rules around it. And I think that's very beneficial as well. Perhaps you can tilt a little bit in terms of what you think about the challenge associated with deep fakes. Let's just pick on that because we have a couple other things we want to touch upon as well. But in terms of how we can, within our organizations, help us manage some of that within our own ecosystem, knowing that externally we are also seeing some efforts to try to control that and rein that in. What is your take on that topic of deep fakes as output of AI?
Yeah, in fact, that's one of the issues that our organization recently dealt with when information came out from the academic leaders of the institution to really talk about that very issue, to be watchful for deep fakes and for information that might not necessarily be based on hard, solid research and not necessarily relying on the input or the output from your inquiry into ChatGPT as being authoritative. And actually looking at the way that perhaps biases and historical discriminatory viewpoints might be promulgated through the information that comes out from ChatGPT and others. So I think it's really it's looking at these things from the vantage point of how we could make sure that we are verifying all of the information upon which we are relying. I can't even imagine what we are going to be encountering as a part of the 2024 presidential election, with all of the things that are likely to show up on social media. I mean, it's going to be an interesting dynamic. Um, One thing, I realized I did not get a chance to just do a brief mention of the Office of Inspector General guidance on the compliance programs. I just want to say a quick word about that. That for those organizations like ours that has the compliance function responsibility and coordination, we model the compliance program after the 7 elements of an effective compliance program as outlined by the U.S. sentencing guidelines. And the Office of Inspector General just recently came out last month with some updated guidance that actually really clarifies and reinforces the importance of things such as the appropriate reporting lines, making sure that there's appropriate visibility from the president and the board. That same type of language is some of the language that is clarified as a part of the IAA updated standards as well. So I think just as we look at the overall regulatory requirements, the frameworks that we're following. It's going to be prudent for all of us in the GRC profession to really be aware of all of those different new changes.
Exactly, exactly. And I think that as we wait for the regulatory bodies to issue guidance, it may be something for organizations to consider to have their own policies and procedures. Well, policy perhaps at this point, but have some guidance and some orientation sessions, some awareness raising, so that we can help the organization get in front of some of these issues while we get more authoritative guidance in these subject areas. Like we were just talking a moment ago about deepfakes in what each organization could and should do in preparation and in anticipation of these dynamics. So let's turn our attention quickly to two other elements, again, related to what we covered previously. So I'm just thinking in terms of what are some of the things going forward that we need to look at. And we touched on a couple of these. We have both climate change and geopolitical dynamics. So, other than what we already spoke about, I think maybe there are a couple additional takeaways and things that we can be on the lookout for. What are your thoughts, Rob?
Yeah, I think if we look to the way that, particularly that issue regarding the threats of terrorism, and if you listen to the news yesterday, where the FBI was on inquiry and asking how well prepared is the United States right now to be able to deal with threats of terrorism, and I'm paraphrasing, but the he was saying, I think the question was, as not leading up to 9/11, there were a bunch of red blinking lights and the United States was not as well prepared for that. Where are we now? And paraphrasing again, but he was saying there are blinking red lights in virtually every threat vector, terrorist threat vector that we have. When we consider all of the different issues that are happening from as a result of the political tensions from the war in Ukraine, from the war in Israel and Gaza. I mean, all of those things are spilling over. So we need to be cognizant of and aware of how your organization can be best prepared if and when there are geopolitical disruptions to your organization based upon where you are or based upon what the political climate is there. So I think these are things that we need to make sure that we are appropriately addressing. So the look ahead in all of these areas is that we need to make sure that they're on our map and that we are seen as value added advisors to our leadership, to our boards, to answer the questions that they have. And boards, quite frankly, are asking not necessarily about what the existing risks are, but what's coming around the corner. What are the emerging risks? What are the things that we need to anticipate and be prepared for? So by
Mhm.
looking at all of these things, we might be able to be adding more value to our organizations.
Exactly. Exactly. Totally agree. That preparedness, something talk in the profession as well in terms of foresight, right? So anticipating and helping the organization anticipate potential issues and take advantage of opportunities as well. So, in terms of that piece regarding opportunities, how about workplace dynamics? We have a number of things that we have been watching related to the workplace in terms of where people work. We spoke a bit about that. We spoke a bit about IT and cyber. We haven't spoken, I believe, enough in terms of employee wellness and in terms of human capital and talent uh, development. And we can certainly cross that over with AI and how we're going to leverage that. But there's so many disruptions taking place in our world that we probably want to think in terms of how we can help organizations understand what its capabilities are, what its limitations are, what kind of gaps exist, and how we can help move the organization forward. So, what are some takeaways as relates to the workplace as we look into 2024?
Well, I'm so glad we're ending with this question because this is really the heart of what it is that we do. We are organizations that serve people, and we are comprised of people who are passionate about supporting the mission of your organization. I'm just going to say, I've got the best audit and compliance team like ever. I'm so blessed to be working with these dedicated professionals. And I have a deep concern and prioritization for wellness, for mental wellness, making sure that we are appropriately supporting people through difficult situations, and really making sure that we're not taking people for granted and what it is that they do to carry out their responsibilities. I'm impressed with what I see from different organizations in terms of their employee investing in their employee wellness programs, and not only from a physical perspective, physical health, but a mental health, availing people of, I mean, just the mental health challenges at organizations are at an all-time high. When you talk with people in the counseling field, I mean, they are seeing a uh, greater number of cases of people who are bringing forward mental health challenges than ever before. So, how can we be more empathetic? How can we be supportive of our employees, of our customers, of the people within our workforce that are on the front facing with our customers? How do we make sure that we're equipping them to be as well prepared to be able to address those challenges?
Absolutely, absolutely. This is a very important topic, absolutely, because what we do requires people to get it done. As much as we talk about automation, we still have that human element that we cannot and should never ignore. So that's going to be here for a very long time. So I want to ask one last question, and then we're going to make it available for our audience to ask us questions. So the last polling question is coming up now. Please answer it. I will take a look at it and we'll comment on it as we get the results, and then we're going to open the Q&A session. So, does your organization have robust plans in place? Very important question. Part of our job is to help the organization be prepared. So, we're looking in terms of that capacity to handle these eventualities. So, as we're getting ready to see the numbers come in from that polling question, um, it's a very important thing to always consider that there are a lot of different dynamics, and a lot of it is not just looking retroactively at what we did and whether or not those accounting transactions were processed appropriately and if we're meeting all the compliance requirements. Of course, those things are important, but we also need to think in terms of how we can help the organization achieve its objectives going forward. And that brings up a lot of other questions. So, what are some of your thoughts, Rob, in terms of that preparedness perspective as we wait for the survey results to come back?
Well, I think in terms of being prepared, I don't think that there is too much that you can do. I think it's a matter of trying to make sure that we are not necessarily walking around like Chicken Little, like the sky is falling, but being prudent and really anticipating what are the ways that we might be able to ensure that at least these things are on our radar, at least
Mhm.
making sure that we're having a conversation about it. We not might not necessarily be able to address that. We might not necessarily be able to have our organizations pour the financial resources into those areas, but how might we at least make sure that this is a part of the conversation for the executive leadership and board?
Okay, very important. Absolutely. So, as we're looking at the results, no one indicated very well prepared. Somewhat prepared, 64%, so two-thirds indicated somewhat prepared. So that's reassuring. Not very prepared, 7%. Very unprepared, 14. That's a fairly large number. And then I don't know, another 14. So if we add very unprepared with I don't know, 28%. So my thought there is there's room for improvement, and there always will be. So even those of you who said somewhat prepared, always make sure you take a look at those documents and preparedness plan. Make sure those things are tested and you're ready to go if you need to. As we look in terms of those challenges and make sure we are ready to support the organization in its efforts. Okay, so let's take a look and now open up the floor. We only have a few minutes left. So let's take a look at the first question. Um, any thoughts on the solar winds matter and liability back to CISOs, right? The information security officers. So, any thoughts on the solar winds matter and liability back to CISOs and other second and third line for either misrepresenting or not properly disclosing their risks? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, and of course that comes from Hal. He's a superstar in this field, and he'd probably be able to help us. A great question, Hal. I appreciate that. And I think when we consider how, quite frankly, a lot of organizations are still dealing with that and might not necessarily have full awareness as to exactly what the impact is as a part of that solar winds compromise. And I think it's, as he's pointing out in the question, how do we make sure that the first, second, and third lines are collaborating to really make sure that we have an appropriate disclosure of exactly what those level of what the perceived level of risk is for the organization, and making sure that that is coordinated with those who are from the legal team as well, because there are likely to be some potential legal implications for that disclosure. So I think, Hal, that's a great question, and probably something that we want to develop as a separate webinar just to talk about that alone.
Right. Yes, absolutely. And there are so many things. And again, cybersecurity and all the things that happen in that space continue to evolve and very problematic because it's a shifting dynamic not only every day, we're talking almost every hour. So let's look at the next question. This is from Chris from YouTube. Do we forget positives in audits? Wondering if this has to do with some of our commentary earlier, Rob. Do we forget positives in audits or not pay them enough attention?
What a great question, Chris. I love it. I love it. And absolutely, we ought to be having our reports as a balanced approach. I have, it's a little bit wrinkled here. It's got a coffee stain on it, but this is the report format that we use, where we actually highlight things in green, not just pointing out the yellow and red areas, but we have an opportunity to really highlight and reinforce those things that our audit clients are doing well. And I'm
Mhm.
intentional about using the term audit client as opposed to auditee, and their
Right.
observations, not findings. We want to try to make sure we're adding a positive element to this and reinforcing those things that are going to help them to continue operating from a position of strength. Great question, Chris.
I like what you're doing there. And again, if for those in our audience who are thinking in terms of standards and requirements and communicating results, remember that the standards as they currently stand indicate that we need to communicate the results of our work. We have generally defaulted to exception reporting, but what you're sharing with us is communicating results, and we can also bring to the leadership's attention satisfactory performance. And you're doing it in a very colorful and very straightforward way. So I commend you. I think it's a very, very nice way to get that done and to help open those communication channels so they see that we're not only focusing on the negative or the problematic and the troublesome and so on, we're also looking at what's working well and we're bringing that to their attention. We have time for one more, and it's a little bit personal. It's the question is, what is that colorful cube behind you, Rob?
This is the COSO cube. This is the COSO cube. I talk about this a lot in our classes and orientation, and I talk about
Yes.
the different elements of the COSO framework, and then I talk about what happens if you don't do things appropriately, and if you don't have monitoring in place. Let me see if I can. All right, yeah. If you don't have monitoring in place and you take that out, the whole thing falls apart. It's a
I love
powerful
it.
illustration. Monitoring is the key to holding the whole thing together.
Very
See, I made a
effective,
little art project.
very straightforward, and we can see the visuals at play. Rob, thank you so much. A pleasure as always to work with you, spend time with you, chat with you, and get your perspective on things. Always very refreshing and helpful to prepare for our role and to help us do what we do. Oh my goodness!
By the way,
Thank you.
I might get in trouble for this. He did not cue me up for this, but if you have not picked up Dr. Murdock's new book, make sure that you pick this up. The Change Agent. It's a phenomenal novel that actually talks about from an internal audit perspective. Put this on your Christmas wish list. Great job, Hernan, on this.
Thank you very
He did
much. I
not tell me to
appreciate
say
the
that, by the
feedback.
way. I might get in trouble for
No,
doing that,
I'm
but I
very
just want to make sure
surprised
I
and
threw
very
some props.
flattered and appreciative. Thank you very much. And yes, I appreciate your support as always. Thank you so very much. Any last words as we wrap up?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with you. I love being able to share some effective practices, things that we're doing here at Harvard University, really developing ourselves as a leader in the space, and surrounded by a very powerful team, and grateful for the resources that you provide. And I'm just grateful for everyone to have an opportunity to join us today, and hope we'll continue the dialogue. And look us up on LinkedIn and connect that way, and continue the dialogue.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you, Rob, for sharing your thoughts and your insights. And hope you join us again when we have another webinar, which will be coming up soon. Stay tuned. Thank you so much. Goodbye.